This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by several friends. They are from the city of Hays, and they're joining us for a conversation on urban water use in Hays specifically. And I talked about this series of water conversations that we're going to be having the next several weeks with Susan Metzger not too long ago. So if you guys recall that conversation, this is one of those follow-up conversations that we discussed there. But like I said, we're going to be talking about urban water use in Hays. And to join me in that conversation, we have with us Stacy Minson. She is a KSU watershed specialist. Stacy, thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. And we also have with us Holly Dickman. She is the water conservation specialist with the city of Hays. So Holly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So obviously, Hays, it's funny to say the word urban, I think. You kind of giggled when I said that the first time, Holly.
Yeah.
Because it is a smaller community, but when we think of Western Kansas, it is an urban community, right?
It is an urban community and certainly one of the larger cities in that part of the state, at least, northwest part of the state. So, yes, I definitely think it's, going to town. That's how it was when I grew up. So
Absolutely.
It was definitely an urban area.
Yeah, for sure. And from what I understand, there has always been groundwater with Hays, right, that the city has been using. But in the 90s, you guys ran into a problem where there were supply concerns, right?
Right. So Hays is a little bit unique. Ellis County is a little bit unique where we rely solely on groundwater, mostly from alluvial aquifers around the Smoky Hill River and Big Creek, which runs through Hays. And so as you can imagine, if it doesn't rain, maybe those rivers and creeks aren't running quite as much as they would be otherwise. And so our well levels can decline. And obviously, if you have a city that's relying on those water sources, you get a little concerned when there's no rainfall and well levels start to fall. So yes, back in the early 90s, there was a almost crisis in a situation where the city was maybe not able to provide enough water for their citizens. And so that's where water conservation really took off and began in the city of Hays. And so ever since then, it's been a very high priority, and we continue that to this day.
Absolutely. So with water conservation and water quantity also comes quality, right, Stacy?
Yes, and that's where my role fits in. We have a watershed plan. Ultimately, our area is what drains into Canopolis Reservoir in Ellsworth County. So as you mentioned, City of Hays being urban for our watershed, the City of Hays is our urban population. So that's where we tie in water quality and water conservation. One of the projects that we do are rain barrels. It's a water conservation benefit on Holly's side, but for us, it's capturing the water as it's coming off of roofs to use for the conservation in the heat of the summer when we need the water. But if we don't have that rainfall running off of yards, off of parking lots, or down curbs, then we're protecting water quality as we go.
Absolutely. And as a municipal city, you guys have put several policies in place or programs as well. Obviously, the rain barrels collecting water, a great program for sure. But in the 90s, you guys were really forced to adjust. So what were some of those water policies that you put in place?
So one of the biggest ones, I think, was the adoption of some ordinances where the wasting of water is actually prohibited. And so we can actually have tickets given by the Hays Police Department for the wasting of water or the misuse of water, those sorts of things. But also our water rate structure is such that the more water you use, the greatly more you will pay. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that came out of that. The other thing that occurred was a big push for efficient fixtures, low-flow shower heads, high-efficiency washing machines, and not low-flow, but high-efficiency toilets, things like that. And so from that day forward, there was more of an effort to educate the public on some of those types of things, and then also to put in place some rebates and programs. And that was all the result of a half-cent sales tax that was actually passed back in the early 90s by the citizens in that area to search for a new water source. And water conservation is itself a water source, if you think about it that way. So if you're saving some of that water for other uses, then that's its own water source. So that was really took off in the early 90s.
Absolutely. And K-State plays a role in kind of the education factor of this in Hays, right?
Yes, for sure. Years ago, the city was working on their stormwater ordinances and their educational, and we had been in doing the watershed plan, working with the cities, the counties, governments, private farm bureaus, local county conservation districts, NRCS, across the watershed. And so one of our connections were, because Hayes is that urban, is how do we educate those urban residents while we still want to work on the agriculture side? So that's how Extension ties in. We work with the county extension office, the county agents. And then Holly's a former Ellis County horticulture agent with Extension. So we already had that working relationship as agents or watershed specialists and agents. And so it worked really well for us to partner and get people to put the connection together on the conservation and the quality that they do go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Canopolis earlier, and that's the major reservoir that fuels Hayes in a lot of ag communities, right?
It doesn't actually fuel Hayes, but the drainage that comes down the creeks and rivers, Big Creek drains into the Smoky Hill River. In Russell County, the Smoky Hill River travels the rest of the way to the reservoir, and it's the oldest reservoir in the state of Kansas, and it's a federal drinking water supply. So it provides water to the city of Ellsworth. Many people, Post Rock Rural Water District is where the water goes. It's treated, goes back outlets. So on farmers, ranchers, they provide livestock supply. There's homeowners that's their water supply at their farms and ranches. And then it goes back up into Russell County to help fuel the ethanol plant, because the city of Russell has a partnership with the city of Hayes as well, looking at a long-term water supply. So for us, it's everything that we're doing on the west end of the watershed, which includes Hayes, goes downstream and does affect that reservoir. And all of us, like you mentioned earlier, we want that clean, safe water supply, and we want the water when we need it.
Absolutely. And through our discussion this whole time, I'm just hearing the connectedness of how all of these different communities and water sources in Western Kansas, how connected they really are. Is that a general theme that you guys feel, is common in your work?
Well, I'm biased talking about water, obviously, but I think water touches everyone, right? So how can we not make that connection between the water that comes out of our faucet at home versus the water that's flowing down the stream through town or maybe out in the countryside? I think it all connects, and certainly some places it's a little more interconnected than others. But for us, the connection there is, I mentioned that, I work by myself. I'm a team of one in my position. And so having to partner with others too, connecting that way is definitely a benefit to us. And so we try to partner anytime we can.
Absolutely. So water is one of those resources where when I think about restrictions or, loss of water sources, it raises a lot of alarms for a lot of people, right? It's one of those resources we have to form a society that's functional. So when concerns over the water resources in Hayes were first brought up, what sort of feelings arose with that?
Well, I grew up in that area, and I don't recall a lot. I was in school at that time, but I do remember a lot of there, obviously, when you're talking about big changes, talking about water restrictions, there's always a lot of talk about those things. So I think the biggest thing is there was a great deal of education given. Obviously, we were in a position where we just really didn't have a choice, right? We had to do something. And so that unfortunately was a point where, it was helpful to get some of those things changed, but it also was a point of contention for some with restrictions and things like that, I've been told. And so, trying to educate the public, try to get those things in place. I mentioned that half-cent sales tax. That was voted on by the citizens there. So it wasn't something that was just forced upon. I mean, there was some knowledge that was going to be taking place with that vote, obviously. So yeah, lots of changes are hard to do, but I think education plays a big role in all of that.
Absolutely. And, we've talked about lots of things here already, and some might be thinking, well, why are we talking about urban water on an agriculture program? But Hayes is an urban or a rural community. It's an agriculture-centered community, I would say. So when we think about the lessons that were learned in Hayes in this specific situation and how it's taken place over several decades now at this point, what are some of the major takeaways that you believe the city of Hayes has learned in the process?
Oh, goodness. Well, I would say, for our situation where we are so reliant on those water sources that are dependent on the weather, right? If it doesn't rain, we're a little concerned. Severe drought, that's something we're watching closely. I will say one thing that we've learned is that, I personally am thankful that we started those programs back in the 90s, because having gone through the drought of 2011, 2012, where some of our neighboring communities had absolutely no outdoor water use completely, they restricted it completely. We were not having to do that. We were not having to go to those extremes because we were still in good shape. So having some of those lessons, back then, kind of hard knocks back in the day, but now we're set in some of those programs and seen as, the leaders in the state as far as water conservation goes with some of our outreach and education and programs and things. I think that's one of the biggest things is just we've learned that was a good thing back in the day. Get it started, and now it's kind of a way of life there, right? I remember growing up as a kid being talked about those things, and I know Stacy and I go into schools all the time and talk to kids, and we hear from kids, hey, I remember that. And then when they move away from the community and they see water wasting, or someone watering the lawn at 2 p.m, they're like, they shouldn't be doing that. It's wasting water. So I think just having those types of lessons, that was a great thing that we did back then. Adjusting to the times, maybe working with businesses and working on even new building codes and things that emphasize water efficiency. That's all in place in the city now. So I think those were some of the lessons that were definitely well learned in our area.
Absolutely. Bending where you can so you don't break in the long run.
Yes.
Absolutely. So, Stacy, as we continue to tie this into kind of K-State's role in the broader picture of water use and conservation and quality concerns across the state of Kansas, but even more so in Western Kansas, what role does K-State really play in facilitating these conversations?
The biggest thing is still our K-State research and extension mission, being there, being the education, being the non-biased. And for us in the city of Hays, when we look at watershed work, for those that are familiar with the city of Hays, Vine Street travels north and south. So on the west side of that street, there's one watershed. On the east side, there's another watershed. So ultimately, they both drain into Big Creek, which again travels downstream to Russell, to Ellsworth, ultimately to the reservoir. But residents can see Big Creek. They go play in Big Creek. They play Frisbee. There's a bridge. There's stepping stones. So when the droughts come and there's not as much water, or when we do get the rains and the water is way up there and they can't go out on some of these places, it's that education again. We've done field days at the park. We've done different things to bring people down there. Library events. We've went and toured the drinking water treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, and Holly and I are in the process. It's been a few years since we've done that, and it's not really something most people think, oh, hey, let's go to this meeting and tour the wastewater treatment plant. But it really gives perspective from when you turn the faucet on to when you turn it off, and having that. And so we have that educational component to make it applicable, to show that we're working on the urban side on picking up pet waste to reduce nitrogen and bacteria, to educating on, do you really need soil fertilizers? Maybe you should do a soil test. So you call your local county extension office, take the soil test. Most of the time it's going to tell us, oh, I probably don't need to use it. So then we can go where Holly works on the native vegetation, converting to buffalo grass, which there's an incentive rebate for homeowners in the city of Hays. Looking at that xeriscaping and use of native vegetation instead of rocks. We put a bunch of rocks out in the urban or the rural environment. We have nothing to maintain that. That causes sediment issues. It causes all kinds of erosion problems potentially. So for us, it's putting the dynamics together on the urban side so that we can let the ag community know, hey, we're doing our part. We want to work with you on the water quality side, but we're also working on the education. And the education that we do, whether it's for the city of Hays, it's applicable across the watershed, ultimately across the state.
Sure, that's the beautiful thing about water, I guess, is it doesn't matter where it's being used or what format it's being put into. It's all the same, right? What benefits one benefits all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say, what place does K-State hold? Obviously, I have a past career in extension. So just the promotion of the right plants in the right places, not only on the ag side, but on the urban side, as far as landscapes and things like that go. That's huge. How to maintain those types of things, how to deal with drought stress, how to deal with excessive rainfall. Those are all educational opportunities there that I hope never go away, because that is very, very important in my role now as water conservation specialist. We all have landscapes, maybe if we have homes, but we don't all know how to maintain them or even what types of plants are growing there. So it really is important to have someone local that maybe is familiar with those things, because we all know the western half of the state is much different than the eastern half of the state. And so I always emphasize that. And just because you can buy it at the store doesn't mean that it necessarily will grow in your landscape in Hays, Kansas. So it's really important to keep that education going.
Absolutely. And if listeners are tuning in and they're looking for these resources that we've talked through today, there's been lots of them. What's a general place that they can go for their best first look at some of this information?
Well, I'm going to promote watersmarthays.com. That's our website, and I have links there to some of the resources for extension even, and water smart landscaping and right plants for Hays, Kansas, and those sorts of things. But I know Stacy on the extension side has lots of resources as well.
My website is mykansaswatershed.com. There's the urban and the ag. And the other thing is your local county agent. I mean, there's a list of suggested trees, recommended plants. And that's the one great benefit. Holly and I have done some work in the last several years with Hays Medical Center. We have native vegetation. They've used some different things. And so there's signage saying that this is a native vegetation. This helps with our stormwater. This helps with our, we have a couple businesses in town that have done some great things that allow us to go do tours. The Master Gardeners in the city of Hays, and the city of Hays right outside of City Hall has a great display of plants so that you can actually go look, see what works. And, Master Gardeners.
Yeah, and at the Extension office, we have a demonstration garden. So we partnered with our local Extension office and got that worked up. And you can see the plants there that are suited for our environment. And they're trying to test them a little bit now with this drought going on. But that was the whole goal, to see how few or how little we could get by with watering.
And the other huge resource we have in western Kansas, we have the experiment station in Hays. So there's native vegetation out there that allows for people to see. But again, extension, that's what we're here for, is to answer those questions, whether it's horticulture, agriculture, family and consumer sciences. They ultimately all go hand in hand, 4-H. And so just getting people to know there are people that can help you with the right plant, the right place, protecting water supplies, conserving water supplies, because there's definitely a need out there.
Absolutely. Well, I can't thank you enough for coming here today, joining me in Manhattan in our studio for this conversation. I know it was a long journey from Hays, but I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Stacy Minton. She is a KSU watershed specialist, as well as Holly Dickman, a water conservation specialist with the city of Hays, joining us for a conversation on urban water use in Hays. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.